This presentation aims to provide an overview of descriptive translation studies and consider its influence on the way we think about translation today. It will begin with a brief overview of the context out of which DTS developed, before moving into a discussion of the field as proposed by Gideon Toury in the 1990s. It will look at how Toury's ideas have been received and criticized, and consider the importance of DTS as a whole in the subsequent development of translation studies and its contemporary role in the field. The prevailing attitude to translation in the 19th century, in the words of Jeremy Munday, was a rigid straitjacket approach. The translated text was seen as an inferior copy of an original, and the translator thus a secondary figure. Work on applying linguistics to translation, carried out by Eugene Nida amongst others in the early and mid-20th century, did little to change this view of translation as mere linguistic substitution, a somewhat mechanical approach that held until the mid-1960s. The first suggestion that translation was beginning to move away from this limiting approach came in the 1970s, and the work of Itamar Ibn Zohar, who developed what became known as the polysystems theory of translation. This target-oriented approach considered translated literature as part of a target culture literary system, which, along with cultural, historical, and other considerations, made up the polysystem. These systems formed an interdependent hierarchy, influencing and being influenced by each other. The position of translated literature within this hierarchy, whether dominant or subordinate, conditioned translation choices and strategies. And polysystems theory is important inasmuch as it was the first real attempt to consider translation beyond the textual level, situating it in its cultural context. The idea of descriptive translation studies was first proposed by James S. Holmes in the 1970s as part of his overview of what translation studies as a discipline covers. Gideon Toury, in his 1995 book Descriptive Translation Studies and Beyond, represented Holmes's divisions visually in a so-called map of translation studies. Pure translation studies, as opposed to applied, was split into two fields, theoretical and descriptive. It's the latter that Toury chose to focus on, and which formed the core material of his book. The arguments put forth in this book form the basis of descriptive translation studies, and as such the main body of this presentation. Toury's first move in 1995 is to justify the necessity for DTS. He argues that at the core of translation studies are facts of real life, and that the discipline is therefore empirical by nature. Translation studies, he claims, has never had a branch that deals specifically with this aspect, and that historically theorists have relied too heavily on individual examples of translation phenomena, when what is really needed is a systematic framework. It's precisely this framework that Toury aimed to develop. Considering translation a real-life activity, his first priority was to separate theoretical considerations of the discipline from translation as a real-world process. His ultimate aim, however, was not to divorce theory and practice entirely, but rather to provide theory with a systematic scientific support structure which would allow scholars working from a theoretical standpoint to test and check their theories. In Toury's words, he aimed to develop a system in which individual studies would be testable and comparable, thereby constituting an ordered accumulation of knowledge. His suggestion for how to do this comprised three main stages. Before considering these steps, though, it's important to note that in DTS, equivalence between source text and target text is assumed. This assumption in itself is a move away from historically prevalent investigations into types of textual equivalence, or whether such a thing is even possible, and towards an idea of functional equivalence. The first stage in Toury's DTS methodology involves considering the target text as part of the target culture system, and as such is closely linked to the earlier polysystems theory, as within considerations of significance and acceptability, it examines contextual factors such as the role of translated literature and translators within the target culture. Stage 2 is to analyze the target text with reference to the source text, identifying shifts and relationships between the two. This stage recalls linguistics work carried out by scholars such as Nida, Vinay and Darbelnay, and others. Once this is done, The final stage is to attempt generalizations about the process that has led from source to target text, attempting to explain the shifts with reference to the cultural factors identified in stage 1. Ultimately, this process, repeated enough times, would create a translation corpus, which could be used to identify the common translation processes, or norms, at work in any given situation, or for any given author, genre, period, and so on. Torrey defines translation norms as the translation of general values or ideas shared by a community into performance instructions appropriate for and applicable to particular situations. In terms of universality, these norms sit between rules and idiosyncrasies, and are the most useful tool in analyzing translation on a large scale. Torrey provides a useful summary of his vision of the state of translation studies as he found it. The discipline he posits should tackle 3 main questions. Firstly, it can consider what translation can involve. He associated work in this field with the kind of unsystematic, example-based translation theory that he hoped to improve upon with DTS. He proposed DTS itself as a consideration of what translation does involve, and why. Here again are the twin emphases of DTS on empirical study and contextual factors. The ultimate aim of DTS, as we have seen, is to approach the third question: what translation is likely to involve? This represents the feeding back into a more elaborate kind of translation theory that Torrey hoped to achieve. While many scholars and translators have embraced DTS, it hasn't entirely escaped criticism. One complaint is that, despite its claims to provide scientific rigor, it's not fully systematic. Stage 2 of Torrey's methodology, choosing and comparing source text and target text units, is somewhat ad hoc in nature and therefore not fully objective or replicable. Theo Hermans has made the point that, by focusing so closely on the target text, important ideological and political factors affecting the source text are overlooked. Mona Baker has argued that by providing a repeated, generalizing methodology, Torrey's norms-based system risks neglecting concrete everyday choices, and by extension privileges normalizing behaviors. This undermines efforts, she claims, made by minority groups to challenge dominant systems. Despite these and other criticisms, the influence of Torrey's descriptive translation studies has been considerable. One of its effects has been to change the way we think about equivalence, from the formal linguistic ideas of the previous century to a more functional understanding of the term that derives from DTS's consideration of translation within the target culture. Similarly, it's doubtful whether the recent cultural turn in translation studies, the increasingly interdisciplinary nature of the field, and the critical inspection of the role of translation in protecting and advancing the rights of minority groups would have been possible without the focus of polysystems theory and DTS on translation in a cultural context. The move away from the idea of translation as simple linguistic substitution has also redefined the role of the translator. Once seen as a kind of facilitator or a secondary figure, with the cultural turn and the examination of translated literature as a significant system within a culture, the translator is again being recognized as an important and influential figure in literary, cultural, and sociological fields. The translator is no longer quite so invisible, as Lawrence Venuti, a scholar whose work owes much to DTS, puts it. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, Torrey's work takes great strides towards providing systematic academic rigor in a young discipline whose theoretical branch relied for too long on work that, while undoubtedly valuable, lacked methodicalness, and whose application was often limited to individual texts or small-scale studies. In the updated edition of his seminal book, published in 2012, Torrey states that his intention in 1995 was to start a debate, and this he certainly achieved. While some elements of his DTS are open to criticism, the target-based approach he advocated, as well as the concept of translational norms, have left indelible marks on translation studies, and are still being developed and refined today. The systematic nature of his methodology has been put to work in large-scale translation analyses, such as the TRACE project in Spain, which investigated the censoring of translations under Franco's dictatorship, and promises to provide a framework for many such future projects, as well as the considerable amount of work still to be done in translation studies as a discipline.